Alrighty, we are back. We're back to our study on 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 1 through 8. This is part 2. If you have not heard part 1 yet, if you've not read my notes on part 1 yet, you need to do that first. It's extremely important to get part 1 in and to understand the entire context surrounding 2 Corinthians 5, 1 through 8, because we didn't even touch those 8 verses in the first discussion, because we spent the entire time considering the context of 2 Corinthians 2 verse 14 through 2 Corinthians 6 and verse 18. Skipping those 8 verses that we're going to start into today. We skipped those completely because it was all concentrated yesterday on the context and how that the context deals with covenantal ideology, covenantal concepts, especially chapter 3, which is the primary part of the context that keeps us on track. It's Old Covenant versus New Covenant. The Old Covenant was in existence at the time Paul wrote, yet it was passing away. In the process of passing away. The New Covenant was also in existence, but it was in the process of coming to fruition, to its fullness, to being established. So there's a transitional period, a transformation period, when people were leaving the Old Covenant mode of life and entering into the New Covenant mode of life. It didn't all happen within a split second on the cross. It happened over a period of a generation of time. God gave them that grace period to leave behind the old and enter into the new. And we talked about how that those who became Christians had died to the law in the AD 50s and 60s. Romans 7 verse 4, Colossians 2 verse 23. And there was no way they could do that if the law wasn't still in existence and viable. So if you have not listened to part 1, please go back and do that, or at least read the first 2 pages of the PDF that I have online for you, the transcript that I have for all of this online, because you really have to get this down in your mind. You have to get that background in your mind, where Paul refers to the idea of the body of death, which is the Old Covenant with its people, and the body of life with its New Covenant and people. Life is resurrection. Resurrection is life. That's why Paul brought up the idea of resurrection in chapter 4, verse 17, and then in 2 Corinthians 5, 1 through 8, spends time on the topic of resurrection life. And the other thing that's important, besides the fact that the context, the setting here of this hub text has to do with covenant, and one covenant passing while another covenant is coming to life, while the seed is dying and what it produces is coming to life. We also have the fact that Paul was referring to something spiritual in nature. Covenantal, spiritual, not something physical. The Old Covenant dealt with physical things, but it was still a covenant from God, of course. In fact, Paul even called it a spiritual covenant. He called it spiritual and good and perfect and all of that, as far as what it was created for to do. And then people who were leaving that covenant and coming into the New Covenant, which was even more spiritual, because it didn't deal anymore with physical things like ceremonies and rituals that pictured something to come and so on. And so we're talking here about something that's spiritual. Like when Jesus said people were passing from death to life. He wasn't talking about people who were physically dead coming to physical life. He was talking about people leaving sin, which separates them from God, and coming to life through forgiveness, through reconciliation to God, which is what the context of this passage even talks about. Chapter 5, reconciliation and righteousness. And righteousness and life go hand in hand. You can't have life without righteousness. So passing from death to life was a spiritual concept, not a physical one. Paul wasn't dealing with the physical in this passage. And that's what's important here as we look at 2 Corinthians 5, 1 through 8, the hub, because everything around it has to do with that which is spiritual, that which has to do with forgiveness, reconciliation, righteousness, and the life, the relationship life that was gained through Jesus Christ to the Creator, the Father. And it's done covenantally. That's the only way it could have been done. It could only have been done through covenant. So they were leaving the old covenant of death, that body of death, Romans 7:24, and coming into the covenant of life. 2 Corinthians 3 verse 18 refers to how they were moving. They, as a people, as a corporate body of people, were moving from the old covenant death into covenant life, from one stage of glory to another greater eternal stage of glory. And then we have verses 16 through 18 of chapter 4 of 2 Corinthians that moves us right into chapter 5 verse 1. And we'll get back to that in just a moment. So, let's look at 2 Corinthians chapter 5 now, verse 1. And I'm going to be reading from the New King James Version, as I said yesterday when we read the context. Verse 1, Paul says, "For we know that if our earthly house, this tent, is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens." The word "for" is the term gar in the Greek, obviously directly connecting this section with the last one. Chapter 5 verse 1 flows right from chapter 4 verse 18, regardless if you see a chapter division there or not. In other words, even under the dire circumstances that Paul had just discussed in chapter 4, the hands of the Judaizers and those who were persecuting him and the other apostles, Paul, due to what he introduced in this section, chapter 5, was not losing heart. That's what he said in chapter 4, verse 16. We do not lose heart. He had just mentioned in verse 14, I think I said verse 17 earlier maybe, but in verse 14 of chapter 4, he brought up resurrection. In chapter 4, verse 16, he said, we do not lose heart. Why? Because the outward man, that is, the old covenant man, was in the process of passing away, while the inward man, the Spirit, the new covenant man, was in the process of coming to fruition, to fullness of life. If that's not resurrection right there all on its own, I don't know what it is. It's the seed dying away and leaving behind the remains of something living. So the seed dies, the old covenant dies, leaves behind, as we talked about in verse 11, chapter 3, something alive. And this thing that was coming to life, the new covenant thing, the new covenant people, everything related to it was going to be eternal. So Paul says it's being renewed day by day at the time he was writing. Then he talks about in verse 17 the far more exceeding weight of glory that we have with the new covenant life. And in 18 he talked about we don't look at things which are seen. We no longer focus on those things of the old covenant which are seen because they're physical. And then he says they are temporary in verse 18. But we rather focus on things which are not seen. Those things that are spiritual, those things which he said in verse 18 are eternal. So then he moves into verse 1 of chapter 5 and says, "For because of all that, because of that resurrection, and because of what I'm getting ready to tell you," Paul was saying, "I do not lose heart." We don't have to lose heart. Even though the persecution is happening the way it is, we do not have to lose heart. And here's why. So he goes into talking about this eternal habitation from God. So, for we know. The word know is from the Greek word ideo, E-I-D-E-O, and it is the word from which we get our word video, which means to see and or perceive, comprehend. Like you see something in your mind. In our minds, we picture what words are conveying. And so Paul is saying, for we know, we see this, we understand this, we comprehend this. We comprehend what? We comprehend that if our earthly house, this tent, is destroyed, we have a building from God. Okay, that's Paul's main point. But he says, if. We know that if our earthly house. The word if is from the Greek word E-A-N. And it generally indicates doubt. It's like our word if indicates doubt. E-A-N generally indicates doubt, but it cannot be limited to that, for it's also used in some places in which no doubt was meant. For example, 1 Corinthians 9:16, Paul said, when I preached the gospel. That word when is E-A-N. 1 John 3, verse 2, John said, when Jesus is revealed, or when he returns. He's talking about his return. There's no doubt there. John wasn't doubting that Jesus was going to return. When he's revealed, when he returns, when I preach the gospel, this is what happens, and so on. So the word E-A-N, though it often does indicate doubt, it doesn't always do that. And in fact, I think in this case, it should have been translated as we know that when our earthly house is destroyed. Okay? That would have made more sense in the context, because no doubt involved here in this context. I don't think anybody has any problem with that, with realizing that Paul wasn't referring to something that had conditions upon it. It was going to happen, regardless. Now let's look at the words our and we. These two pronouns we discussed in the intro about how that by the first person plural pronoun, Paul was referring to himself, the other apostles, and all faithful Jewish Christians, as opposed to his audience of Gentile Christians who were being heavily influenced by Judaizers to become proselytes to the Old Covenant religion. All you have to do is contrast we and our in verses 1 through 11 with you and your in verses 11 through 13. And this corresponds perfectly with the very next word, earthly. Paul said, for we know when our earthly house is dissolved, or whatever. The word earthly here is from the Greek word epigeios. This genitive term may more literally be translated as of the land. Check out Thayer's lexicon about that. Thus, metaphorically, referring to those who dwelt on the land, or to the things those land dwellers conceived and or created. The word gay, that's the root word for epigeios, the word gay, which is the word for land, practically always has reference to the land of Israel, and therefore things related to that land. For example, the Israelites with their city, temple, priesthood, sacrifices, and yes, their covenant. All those things were related to Israel, the land of Israel, the people of that land. Epigeios is also found in John 3 verse 12, where in palpable frustration, Jesus referred to how that he, as God, verses 11 and 13, had taught Israel, the word you is plural in verse 12, epigeios things. The New King James says earthly things. That's the epigeios things. And they in general didn't understand when God taught those things to them. And what were the things God taught them? Right, things related to their covenant law, temple, priesthood, sacrifices, and on and on. That is, things related directly to their land, their world, if you will. Another place epigeios is found is in Philippians 3, a chapter in which Paul wrote about the troublesome Judaizers. Just check out verse 2. That's pretty clear. In verses 18 and 19, he called them the enemies of Christ, whose end is destruction. Why? Because they've set their minds on epigeios things. And what other things would the Judaizers have their minds set upon except what we've just discussed per the things related to their Old Covenant world? So, how beautifully this fits. Our and we has to do with the Jewish Christians. Paul's talking about Jews, their world. Jews and Judaizers. The Jews were under the Old Covenant law, what he had been talking about since chapter 2, especially in chapter 3. Chapter 3 is a contrast between the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. And Paul's talking about we and our, him, and the apostles and the Jews who had become Christians, and how they were moving out from under the Old Covenant and into the New Covenant, leaving that behind and moving on forward. The word earthly then fits right in after that. Epigeios, their land, things that had to do with them and their land, their world. What's the next word? House. The term okia is used hundreds of times in the Greek Old and New Testaments and simply refers to a dwelling place. Since it can be used in both a physical and a spiritual sense, the meaning must be determined by context. So, in this context, earthly house, that phrase, earthly house, apparently referred to a dwelling place associated with their fleshly realm, as opposed to a dwelling place of the spiritual realm, as the terms God and heavens later obviously suggest. And what might Paul have had in mind specifically when he wrote of this epigeios house, earthly house, epigeios house, the house of that land? I think this next term implies the answer to the question. The next word is tent. This term, skenos, isn't found anywhere else in the Bible except here and in verse 4. Besides the fact that it refers to a temporary dwelling place, it's derived from the term skene. Little seems to be known about this term, so let's consider skene. Firstly, just as we know that the English word hypocrite is from the Greek word hypokrites, which refers to an actor, so skene is the Greek word from which we get our English word scene. Okay, skene in the Greek is S-K-E-N-E. And the K there is our C, S-C-E-N-E. So you can see how that scene comes from skene in the Greek. And scene is related to actors, what actors do. So how does that fit here? Well, early Greek hypocritai used tents and changing booths for their performances, and eventually, when scenic backdrops began to be used for their plays, that same term was applied to the staging props. Over time, skene came to be applied to any scenic or skenic, we could say, background, thus coming down to us today as scene. In fact, we do have one word in English just slightly closer to the term Paul used, skenos, and that is our term, scenography. Scenography or scenography, which is the painting of stage scenery, as by the ancient Greeks, says Thayer. How beautiful that is of a picture for us to comprehend the ideology here that Paul's putting forth. Anyway, tent is the main point here. Something that covers, which is what the root word ske, S-K-E, in Greek essentially means. Has to do with covering. A tent covers. So, let's move on. Secondly, according to one scholar, skene is used about 300 times in the Greek Old Testament to refer to God's tabernacle, meaning that it was obviously a common term used in relation to the very edifice that signified the old covenant habitation or world. Catch that? What else more signifies and depicts the old covenant world of Israel than the temple? What more depicts that than the temple or the tent or the tabernacle that God had set up through Moses? Now let's consult 3 places in the New Testament where it's used in this very manner. In Acts 7:44, Peter said, "Our fathers had the tabernacle," Greek word skene, "of witness in the wilderness as he appointed, instructing Moses to make it according to the pattern that he had seen." Likewise, from someone, by the way, at Stephen's stoning, Hebrews 8 verse 5, Paul, when writing about the work of the high priests, said that they served the copy and shadow of heavenly things, as Moses was divinely instructed when he was about to make the tabernacle, skene. For God said, "See that you make all things according to the pattern shown to you on the mountain." And one more time, in Revelation 15:5, of one of his visions, John said that he saw the temple, naos, of the tabernacle, skene, of the testimony, in heaven. Now here's what's significant about that verse. There are 2 primary Greek terms for tabernacle. Naos, N-A-O-S, which refers to the temple proper, and hieron, H-I-E-R-O-N, which refers to the entirety of the temple area. So, for example, when it speaks of Jesus running the animals out of a temple with a whip, it's speaking of the area outside the naos, that is, the hieron, not the naos itself. For, by God's own law, Jesus was not allowed in the naos. Now this means that the word Paul used, skene, was used by John as another term for the temple, that is, the naos, the building which, according to Josephus, represented the old heavens and earth habitation or covenant world for God's people. So here we are. Real quick recap. Our and we, Jewish people, Jews who had become Christians, earthly, had to do with the land of Israel. Earthly house, the house that belonged to physical Israel. Tent, tabernacle, Israel's tabernacle, the very thing, the very temple that represented the law and the Old Covenant world, the Old Covenant cultus, the Old Covenant mode of existence. That's what Paul's talking about here. Now, I did happen to read the following on skenos that I think is interesting. For a Jew, skenos would be naturally associated with the desert wanderings of the Israelites after the Exodus. To a Christian, the term would allude to the tabernacle as the locus of God's presence among his people during the wilderness wanderings, and then to the indwelling of the Spirit of Christ as the mode of God's presence in believers during their pilgrimage of faith to the promised land of Christ's immediate presence. That's from Murray Harris's comments on 2 Corinthians. In a footnote, he wrote that Paul used skenos rather than skene because he wished to allude to the ad interim tent of meeting, Exodus 33, 7 through 11, which was intended for provisional use until the tabernacle was constructed. Catch that? In other words, Murray Harris said, that Paul chose skenos because he was referring specifically to the tent of meeting that could be taken down and put back up, taken down and put back up, and which would eventually completely be done away with. It was a transitional thing, like in the 40-year period. The transitional tent of meeting. Catch that, okay? Transitional. With all this in mind, it appears that Paul wasn't only thinking of the contrast between the Old Covenant world with the soon-to-come fullness of the New Covenant world, but he was also thinking of the very time he lived as the antitype to the wilderness wanderings, which, of course, wouldn't be surprising since he also seemed to imply this in Hebrews 3:5 through chapter 4 verse 10, in which he even specifically referred to a generation as a period of 40 years, the time spent in the wilderness. Chapter 3 of Hebrews verses 9 through 10 and 16 through 17 deal with that. Question: who else thinks it might be slightly problematic to the traditional interpretation of this passage that Paul referred to a plural amount of individuals while he referred to a singular house for them? To me, this pictures a plurality of family members living together in one house, under one roof, in this case in and under a new covering or covenant. Two obviously related terms, that is, covering and covenant. This is very cool stuff. I mean, I can't believe I couldn't see this many years back when I looked at this text as an individual thing. That individuals are going to put off their literal physical fleshly bodies and put on some other sort of body. But so far, not only with regard to the entire context we discussed in part 1, but even here just with the words Paul chose in verse 1. Just those few words. It's obvious Paul wasn't speaking about individual bodies, individual flesh and bones, but that which is of the context referring to covenant. Their covenant covering. They're putting off the old covenant covering, putting on the new covenant covering. Let's just move on, and we'll get a lot more that builds right on that and supports that concept very clearly. Look at the word destroyed. I didn't find this term, which is kataluthe, at all in the Greek Old Testament, but I did find it 17 times in the New Testament. It's never used in reference to the demise of the human body, which is what tradition says Paul meant here by tent. But I did find it used 8 times in the New Testament in relation to the destruction of the tabernacle. Acts 6:14, Matthew 24:2, Matthew 26:61, and Matthew 27:40, as well as, of course, Mark's and Luke's parallel accounts of those verses. The word for destroyed, kataluthe, means to dismantle, an idea that corresponds perfectly to what one does with a tent. When he's finished with it, he dismantles it. Furthermore, with reference back to our point about Paul speaking of a plural amount of individuals and a singular home or tent for them, this term is an aorist tense verb, meaning that, as M.J. Harris said, the event is viewed as a specific single occurrence, a one-time incident for all simultaneously. Murray Harris saw the corporate concept here in this passage, and Murray Harris is not a believer in fulfilled prophecy. So it's not because people believe in fulfilled prophecy that they tend to make this context corporate, as some have said and claimed about those of us like myself who now see this as a corporate collective idea in 2 Corinthians 5:1-8 instead of an individual thing. Again, Murray Harris even saw that, a futurist. Now, how does that mesh with the intermittent deaths of individuals? This whole idea of it being a corporate. By the way, we can already see in verses 1-4 here that Paul was building upon the idea he introduced in chapter 4, verse 16. That is, just as chapter 5, verse 4 about mortality being swallowed up by life corresponds to chapter 4, verse 16, about the inward man being daily renewed until the renewal was complete. So the destruction of the earthly house, the epigeos house, in 5 and verse 1 corresponds to the perishing of the outward man in chapter 4, verse 16. Just check out the idea of the seed being sown and a germ being raised in 1 Corinthians 15, 42 through 43, for example, and John 12, verse 24 that we mentioned in the first part of this series about the seed dying in order to bring life. The next phrase in verse 1 is we have. Paul said in verse 1, for we know that when our earthly house, that is this old covenant house, this tent is destroyed, we have a building from God. The phrase we have is what we're looking at now. In the original, this verb is in what's called the emphatic position, meaning that Paul was stressing the certain possession of this building of God. In other words, he had no doubt there was a dwelling place for them in God's future fulfilled kingdom. That is future to him, not to us. The kingdom being an inheritance, it's as we say of a youth who's about to inherit a great estate. He has so much. Even though he doesn't have it in hand literally, he still has it. It's still his. So that's a position these people were in at this time. They were in a transition time. They were receiving the building of God. It was not finished yet. It was not there yet. Like Hebrews 12, verse 28, AD 63. They were in the process of receiving the kingdom. The kingdom would come with the fullness of the new covenant. New covenant wasn't established yet, according to the time of Hebrews was written, Hebrews 10, verse 9. So Paul's saying, we have it. It's in our grasp. And what is it we have, Paul was saying? A building. A building from God. Let's look at the word building for a second. As with the previous term for tent, this term, oikodome, however you want to pronounce that, is pretty interesting. It comes from the Greek word oikos, referring to a house or dwelling place, as we discussed earlier, and doma, referring to an edifice with a roof. Doma being, of course, where we get our word dome. The two words combined signify an established, concrete structure, that is, a permanent home as opposed to a temporary one. Not only is this a reminder of King Solomon's temple as opposed to nomadic Moses' tent of meeting, but this also corresponds perfectly to Paul's statement in 4 verse 18 in which he contrasted the temporary with the eternal. Again, see, Paul is keeping their minds on the idea that they are still in a transition period. They are still under an old covenant roof, so to speak. But that covenant is passing away. It is going away into oblivion. But, Paul said, we have a building of God, something that's permanent. Now, although the noun oikodome primarily refers to a literal edifice, the term also is used metaphorically to refer to intellectual or spiritual edification. In fact, out of the 18 times this word is found in the New Testament, 12 of those times is translated in that sense. 3 of the other 6 times it refers to the various buildings included within Herod's temple. And the last 3 times were all by Paul as follows. In 1 Corinthians 3:9, he referred to the church as God's oikodome. In Ephesians 2:21 and 22, Paul said of those first generation Jew and Gentile church members that they were the oikodome, being joined together, growing into a holy temple in the Lord, in whom they are being built together for a habitation of God. See, they were part of it, but they didn't have it in completion yet. So in 2 Corinthians 5:1, when Paul used this term one last time, how should it be interpreted? He wasn't referring to intellectual edification, and he wasn't referring to Herod's temple, for that Hieron actually represented the very thing, the old heavens and earth, that Paul was contrasting in this context. So it seems to me that we should interpret Paul here to be speaking of the same thing as in Ephesians chapter 2 and 1 Corinthians chapter 3. That is, he had the future habitation of all saints in mind, the fullness of the kingdom, the new Jerusalem, the new heavens and earth, that which would be forever. In other words, it wouldn't be temporary. I like what McKnight wrote, James McKnight. He said, "This building is the city which Abraham and his sons, who were heirs with him of the promised country, looked for while they lived in tents, and of which city the builder and maker is God." Hebrews 11:10. To this city Paul gave the name New Jerusalem and the city of the living God, because, as in the earthly Canaan, which was a type of the heavenly country, Jerusalem was the place where deity resided by the visible symbol of his presence, and to which the tribes went up to pay homage to God. So, in the heavenly country there is a particular place where deity manifests his presence and receives the worship of the church of the firstborn. Anyway, Paul went on to say that it was a building from God. This preposition is a translation of the Greek word ek, ek, which means from out of. That is, out or from out of something as its source. Unlike the temporary tent of meeting that God indirectly had constructed by means of earthlings or land dwellers, Hebrews 6:5, the permanent building under construction in this context is spoken of as being from, that is, out of, from God as its direct source. It's a building from God, and then he defines it as a house, the feminine form of the term Jesus used in reference to the Hieron, dwelling place. However, since it fits perfectly at this point, and since Peter in 1 Peter 2:5 used some of the same terminology that Paul did here, I think it's worth reading. Speaking to Christians, Peter said, "You are being built up a spiritual house." Just catch the present tense there. Are being built up into a spiritual house. Well, they have been Christians already for a while. But at the same time, Peter said, you are being built up. Besides that verse, Hebrews, which I of course believe Paul wrote, also sheds more light on our text. After speaking of the true tabernacle in chapter 8, verse 2, Paul went on in chapter 9, verse 11 to write that Christ came as high priest of the good things about to come, with the greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands, that is, not of this creation. Couldn't fit much better as we flow into the next phrase in 2 Corinthians 5, verse 1, which is, not made with hands. George Beale wrote, that Paul has a temple image in view is apparent from the phrase, not made with hands, which virtually everywhere else is a technical way of speaking about the new eschatological temple. In addition, the references to building, house, and dwelling occur in Paul elsewhere with respect to Israel's temple or the church as the temple. Let's consider some other passages in which this terminology is found. In Daniel chapter 2, verse 35 and verse 45, they speak of Christ and his kingdom, which, by the way, are inseparable. They're one by virtue of being married, are spoken of as being cut out without hands. Again, Daniel 2, 35 and 45, Christ's kingdom was spoken of as being cut out without hands. Though at one time it may have been considered by the Jews to be true, by the time of Acts 7:48, Stephen informed his Jewish audience that the Most High does not dwell in temples made with hands. In Ephesians 2:11, Paul spoke of the Jews as being the old covenant people who were known as the circumcision made in the flesh with hands. While in Colossians 2:11, he spoke of Christians in general as being those who were circumcised with a circumcision made without hands. Lastly, when speaking of the fall of the old system and the rise of a new one, around AD 63, Paul wrote that God has promised, saying, "Yet once more I shake not only the earth, but also heaven." Now this, yet once more, indicates the removal of those things that are being shaken as of things that are made, that the things which cannot be shaken may remain. Hebrews 12:27. Taking our minds right back to 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 11 that we discussed in part 1. The next word is eternal. Of the term aionios, for eternal, in chapter 4, verse 18, which is the same here, Thayer said it means without end, never to cease, everlasting. Incidentally, speaking of time, oikodome, that earlier word that we talked about, is related to oikonomia, which refers to any administrative period. You got to catch that. Oikodome is related to oikonomia, which refers to any administrative period. Ephesians 1 verse 10 is the verse that comes into the picture here. In that verse, it talks about the administration, that all things in heaven and earth would be brought together in Christ. The last phrase in 2 Corinthians 5 verse 1 is in the heavens, eternal in the heavens. At the time Paul wrote 2 Corinthians, which was around AD 56, this spiritual and eternal habitation for Christians was in the process of being built. It hadn't arrived yet, and thus was still in heaven or the heavens, meaning the same thing. Just compare the usage of that in Matthew's account with Mark's and Luke's accounts. Mark and Luke may say heaven, Matthew may say heavens, and vice versa. Mean the same thing. And so you might end verse 1 by studying Galatians 4:21 through 31. That will give you even more information about what Paul was dealing with and talking about here in verse 1. So, verse 1 took a lot of time. The other verses won't take as much time, but verse 1 is so important as it sets up all the rest of what Paul is going to be talking about. Verse 1 is the most important verse of these 8 verses. So you might have to go back and re-listen to this or get the notes and go over them again to be sure you have verse 1 down in your mind before you set out to start studying the rest of the verses in this paragraph. Okay, well, I thank you for your time, and I look forward to sharing part 3 with you pretty soon.